Forget all you know about podcasts. We welcome you to an experience uniquely different. Please join us for our coverage of all entertainment on the fringe of society. The candles are lit, the lights are down low. It is now time to welcome our host as he steps up to the pulpit. The sacrifice has been prepared for the midnight black mass.
Ghastly greetings, groovy ghoulies. It's the Rev, just kidding. You thought it was like some kind of scary alien robot. Not. It is the devil you know, the maniacal minister of the occult, the Reverend Dan Wilson, for another edition of the Midnight Black Mass. Here on the Potty Humor Network at youtube.com/pottyhumor, as well as syndicated on the Beyond Ringside Radio Network at beyondringside.com. By now, if you're subscribing to us, you already know this, but you can also get us on Stitcher Radio, which is a beautiful mobile app that you can download that puts us right there at your fingertips. Get us on iTunes now, all on the Potty Humor channel. That's one word, Poddy. Hit subscribe and never miss an episode. So how you been? How'd you enjoy the episode with the Big Wood last week? I thought it was quite a good time, and I really always enjoy talking shop with one of the veterans because I always learn something. Even if I've had those conversations 1,000 times with Woody, you always learn something new. And then the week before that, we had Les Thatcher on the show. So much wrestling knowledge. So I apologize to you tonight, taking just a little bit of a break from wrestling. We're still going to talk wrestling on the show, but and even our guest tonight we'll talk some wrestling with. However, this is a big week for me professionally, as it is every single year. This is DragonCon weekend. I'm going to be there this Friday night. Tomorrow, August 29th. 7 p.m. Hyatt Regency Ballroom, Atlanta, Georgia. DragonCon Championship Wrestling is going to be huge. I've already gotten my lineup. I'm going to be managing the Strong Style Psycho Tank. Going to be reuniting with the Hate Junkies. And also going to be managing my reigning and defending Dragon Cup champions Azrael and Slim J in a tag team match. And so it's really going to be a good time. A lot of reunions with a lot of former guys that I'm anxious to see. Tank, of course, me and him stay pretty active together out there on the circuit, but I haven't really spent a lot of time with the Hate Junkies or Azrael or Slim J in a long time. So that in and of itself is making this an extremely special night for me, but not to mention the conning. You know, I'm a little bit geeky, me and my wife in particular. We really like we like horror movies, we like fucking comic books, we like all that cool shit. And so DragonCon is this multimedia mass convention that converges on downtown Atlanta. It takes over 4 to 6 of the major hotels, depending on what's going on that year. And it's awesome. They have celebrities from all over, like just anything you can think of, like Star Wars, Star Trek, True Blood, Walking Dead, Doctor Who, fucking like video games, anime, animation, big screen movies. James Gunn, the director of Guardians of the Galaxy, is going to be there. Ralph Macchio, they do like a lot of the nostalgic things. Like Lou Ferrigno's there every year. He's the nicest dude. It's really awesome. So you should come check it out. It's happening all weekend, but the DragonCon Wrestling is going on tomorrow night at 7 p.m. That's Friday the 29th. Now, if you're listening on Beyond Ringside, you will already have missed that, but I've told you about it for weeks, so you had no excuse. So when you're kicking yourself for not going to Atlanta, remember, I told you for weeks now here on the Midnight Black Mass that you needed to go to DragonCon. So So with that, all that being said, DragonCon's a huge week. It involves a lot of prep work for me and packing, and there's usually a costume involved for the post and pre-show festivities and other things. So, did not have time to record a new interview this week. And I thought I had a last minute guest. You notice I tweeted out that we had a surprise guest. I thought I had a last minute person lined up, and then that fell through. So I said, fuck it. I had this interview that I've been sitting on for a long time. It originally aired back on the Georgia Wrestling History Radio Network. But since we've made our new online presence over the last couple of years with the YouTube channel and just recently all of the RSS feed subscriptions, I know a lot of you people that are new to the show haven't heard this one. So if you're an old fan, I apologize. You can tune out after I get done with the rant and all the other normal stuff you're here for. But if you haven't heard this one, I urge you to stick around because this is a good one. And it's not wrestling related, though we talk a little bit of wrestling. He was a fan out of the Gulf Coast area in Alabama. So our guest does have a familiarity with wrestling, and it does definitely come up in the interview. But big star from Marvel Comics, who right now he is the writer of Thor, and he's writing the major Marvel event Original Sin, as well as the writer of the Image comic original, which is a smash hit, Southern Bastards. His name is Jason Aaron. He's from Alabama. He used to sell sex toys for a living, and now he writes comic books for the biggest comic book company in the world. Very cool interview. We had a great time. Had a great time talking to Jason Aaron, and so we're going to let you relive that. And like I said, old-time fans, I am sorry if you've heard this one before. But we're back next week. I got an announcement right now I'm going to drop. Our guest for next week has already been lined up. You know, you've been watching the Monday Night Wars on the WWE Network, which has been really hot, really awesome show, actually, recapping the various history of the Monday Night Wars and the important points of those times. Former WCW Nitro announcer Scott Hudson is going to be our guest on the show next week. So wrestling fans, I'm delivering big for you next week. And we got a guy, you're really into the Monday Night Wars right now. We got a guy that lived it, who was right in the middle of it. Scott Hudson, good friend of mine, will be on the show next week. So let's get the rest of my plugs out of the way. I already told you about DragonCon, right? So we'll move on to Empire Wrestling, which is essentially my home promotion right now. It's where I'm getting a lot of chances to use my talents, both in the announcing capacity. The managing thing has kind of ran its course there, but like announcing and behind the scenes, and it's really great. I'm having a great time with them, and I will be back in action at Empire Wrestling with another live Midnight Black Mass on September the 6th, as well as continuing to provide the play-by-play announcing for their new online television product, EmpireWrestling.net. You can go to that website and check it out. There's a free login. They just ask that you provide your email to be added to their mailing list, and that gives you a password. You get in there free video on-demand content. They usually pick the best match or two from the week, mix it, and put it up there. This past weekend, we were at D1 Sports Training Complex in Chattanooga, Tennessee. What a night! Packed house. Every seat in the building was full. Had 275 chairs out on the floor. Every one of those was full. Many people standing around. Estimated it had to be over a crowd of 300 easy, and that's not a giant building, so it was just jam-packed and energetic. We saw Gunnar Miller, the former UTC linebacker. That's University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. He took on his trainer, Ace Rockwell, in the main event. It was interrupted by the Cabal, Sean Tempers and Johnny Viper. It was turned into a tag team match. And all hell broke loose. Speaking of hell breaking loose, Tank and Bobby Hayes. This feud, I can't believe they picked it back up this many years later. I was watching this feud back in like 2000 and 2001 when I first broke into the wrestling business in my very early years. This set the world on fire down in Dalton, Georgia. And then it's eventually what led to both of those guys getting opportunities at bigger promotions and going on to becoming pretty substantial independent wrestling stars. A lot of people, a lot of the wrestlers, I don't know about the fans, but a lot of the wrestlers consider those guys legends of the indie area here in the Southeast. They've really been the best of the best, and they have just beat the ever-loving hell out of each other for a long time. Now, there was a break there. Now they're back at it. They're fighting At D1, they had us in the whole locker room, and they couldn't keep them apart. It was a double count out, just a wild, crazy melee. And speaking of wild, crazy melees, on the live Midnight Black Mass, we actually had two radio show hosts from the local area. From the Cat Country 95.3, we had Josh and Chase from Josh and Chase in the afternoon. They were there to make a big announcement about what was going to happen going forward with a partnership between Empire Wrestling and the radio station and this very popular dance club, which you may have one in your town. It is a chain called the Electric Cowboy. And so they were coming out to make this big announcement that Empire's going to this huge venue, and the Cabal, yet again, this time in the form of Matt Fortune and the little hemorrhoid that runs around with him, whose ass I beat in the manager versus manager, hair versus hair match, as you can see on YouTube. Just type in the Rev versus Steve Dave. But this little hemorrhoid comes out here, and he gets in these guys' faces and bucks up on them. And hey, I mean, you know, these guys were here as guests of the promotion. He put his hands on them, so the radio disc jockey, he wasn't playing around. He slapped the piss out of him. And, well, the Empire owner had to come out there, and the security and the police almost got called, and that was a wild scene as well. So apparently Steve Dave called into the radio show. We'll be back at the Empire Arena on September the 6th. In Rossville, Georgia at 22 Austin Avenue, and all of this wildness that happened at D1, we'll kind of get to see what happened as far as what that resulted in. And I'm sure there's going to be some craziness. I know Josh and Chase are planning on being there from the radio show to respond to what's going on there. I know that Tank and Bobby Hayes' situation is going to be addressed. You want to be there on September the 6th. For damn sure at Empire Wrestling. Again, you can find them online at EmpireWrestling.net, on Facebook at Facebook.com/Empire Wrestling, on Twitter at EmpirePW. Check them out. One of the best quality independent wrestling promotions going. And there's a lot of them, and I'm fucking proud of that. Like, I'm really proud that the influence of guys like Bill Behrens and Jeff G. Bailey and the level of quality that they expected has spread all over Georgia, kind of from there, and from other people too. I'm not just like, they're not solely to give credit for, but certainly they were a strong influence. But all of the people that banded, like Stephen Platinum, like what they got going up on in PWX in North Carolina, like I'm just really proud that there's some quality indie wrestling coming up in the South now, and maintaining a standard of quality, and that's awesome. Anarchy Wrestling certainly is that. But so, with that all being said, check out Empire. You can also catch me for Deep Southern Championship Wrestling this Sunday, Red Bank, Tennessee, 3 p.m. afternoon bell time. I'll be managing the Strong Style Psycho Tank there, as well as he teams with Cyrus the Destroyer to take on the good old boys. Never meaning no harm, beats all you ever saw, got their asses whipped and a broke jaw from Tank in Red Bank, Tennessee, this Sunday, 3 p.m. at Deep Southern Championship Wrestling. You can follow them on Twitter at DSCW101 or online at dscw.org. Okay, and then the final date I'm going to plug here, Sunday, October the 26th, 3 p.m., AIWF Wrestling Showcase event in Red Bank, Tennessee, also at the TWE Arena there. This will be an event featuring talent from all over the country. Really excited about this. Going to be providing the play-by-play. Going to be putting on my dragon horns there for another night. And figuratively, not fucking really at all. but no, it's going to be awesome. Really looking forward to that. And calling the AIWF Pro Wrestling Showcase, doing the play-by-play. And the only thing I'll do before I get into the rant is that I heard just as we went on the air that Jake the Snake Roberts had been hospitalized in Las Vegas. And after all the progress he's made, it's sad to hear that. Apparently he's got something to do with pneumonia, so he's sick. I don't think that there's any concern that he may have relapsed or has done anything destructive. It just sounds like he got a cold. I mean, you know, he's fought cancer and other things. Give the guy a break. But so, you know, Jake's a great guy. I've enjoyed every moment I ever spent around him. He's a wise man. He's a hilarious man. And he's a true legend and credit to the business. So, Jake, seriously, all due respect, please, please, please get better. Okay, so before we go to the break and go to this great archived Midnight Black Mass Classic. Gonna talk about money marks on the Revs Rant. What the fuck is a money mark? Well, a money mark is a wrestling promoter that starts a promotion not to be in business, not to improve the quality of the wrestling world, but for vanity, for self-indulgence. To put it crudely, to be a mark. So, you see a lot of this in wrestling, and it's always unfortunate. It's always unfortunate when you find out a quality promotion has a money mark behind it, because you know sooner or later the bottom is gonna drop out. It's one thing to have financiers, people knowing that they might take a loss, do have money to spare. There's not a lot of that in indie wrestling, but if you know people and have a quality product, it's not impossible, right? It's another thing to have a money mark, because the second you smarten this guy up too much to the inner workings of the business, it's going to crack his mirror, his funhouse mirror that he sees the world in. It's going to crack that right down the middle, and then he's going to get bitter, and he's going to pull his money out because he had stars in his eyes and was going to get to hang out with all of his favorites, and then thought he was going to make $1 million. And then when his house is in foreclosure and his wife has left him and whatever, then he's up shit creek, and you got to either move on to a new money mark, or you got to fucking have a wrestling operation that makes money. It ain't impossible. It ain't easy, but it ain't impossible. I think people have proven that. If you got somebody can help you start up, that's one thing. That'd be a financier, not somebody who's just throwing money, because you're going to burn them out. You're going to burn the town to the ground. It goes back to what I said last week about hot-shotting these towns where you get, oh, this great show with every legend you ever knew. Fucking WrestleMania 5 main event, or not main event, but the whole living card who ain't signed to fucking WrestleMania 5 is going to be there, okay? And then you got like all the top Ring of Honor superstars are going to be there, and like all this fucking recently released WWE guys. And people show up, they may not, but you're not coming back because the money mark lost their ass. So the point is, good for your wallet temporarily, bad for the long-term health of the wrestling business. These people do not know our business. You never get anything for free in this life. There is nothing for free. You will always pay the price one way or the other. So just think about that before you decide to get in business with a quote-unquote money mark. So that's all I've got right now. We got Jason Aaron coming up after the break. Don't go anywhere. And don't forget Scott Hudson coming up next week on the Midnight Black Mass. We'll be right back.
Whether you're having an autograph session, personal appearance, or live event, we got just the person you need to contact for all of those needs. SBI Bookings is home of some of the best stars in the wrestling industry today. They provide you with the best talent this business has to offer, from Kevin Nash, Larry Zbyszko, Scott Steiner, and many, many more. So who will you contact next time you're planning an event? The men of SBI Bookings. Check them out at sbibookings.com.
Hi, but not too high. This is George Carlin. I'm sitting here. I have on a yellow hat, a pink shirt, dark sunglasses, and an earring in my ear. And I'm going to tell you not to get into heavy drugs. Well, it sounds bizarre, I know, but there are other things to do with your life, other things to help you make it. Heavy drugs make it all worse, and they help you die.
You're listening to the Midnight Black Mass on the Potty Humor Network and BeyondRingside.com. Just reminding you where you can pick up your Midnight Black Mass merchandise. That's midnightblackmass.spreadshirt.com. That's midnightblackmass.spreadshirt.com. We have Midnight Black Mass t-shirts as well as reject t-shirts and other assorted Potty Humor merchandise. Also check us out with the other array of great podcasts on the Beyond Ringside Radio Network. That's Sundays at 11 p.m. is when the Midnight Black Mass airs. with a new episode each week. That's 24/7 wrestling, MMA, and talk radio streaming beyondringside.com.
Wrestling fans, Anarchy Wrestling television tapings are the second and fourth Saturdays of every month at 4236 Level Grove Road in Cornelia, Georgia. For more information on Anarchy Wrestling and on the shows, to watch the television product, and a whole lot more, go to anarchy-wrestling.net. That's Anarchy Wrestling, the second and fourth Saturdays of every month in Cornelia, Georgia.
Your time is precious. We greatly appreciate you sharing some of it with us. Of all here, the ghouls in the late night on the Midnight Black Mass, to give us a look behind the beard. So let's get right to the meat of things. Big things happening for you right now in the comic book world, man. You are currently writing Wolverine, the X-Men, the Incredible Hulk. You're taking part in a huge crossover event coming up with X-Men versus the Avengers. I know, just reading your columns and things, that you grew up a comic book fan. How does it feel to be sitting in that spot right now?
Well, of course, it's awesome. I've been a comic book fan since I was a little kid. Actually started out probably as more of a DC fan than a Marvel guy. But Marvel was, the company that gave me my first big break as a writer, I guess about 11 years ago now. It's awesome. I get to stay home and make up stories for a living and actually get paid to do it. It still kind of boggles my mind sometimes. Whenever those checks show up with Spider-Man on it, I'm still a little surprised. It's been a good couple of years for me. I'm very happy, with what I'm doing at Marvel, and I think, this year in particular is going to be a crazy one for me. I've got a bunch of the stuff I've been doing for a few years now wrapping up. And a bunch of new stuff, kind of getting underway. Avengers, X-Men, obviously the biggest one of those.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're going to talk about that more in detail here in just a moment. Let's just take a look at a couple of the things you're working on right now. What about the Hulk? That's a character, just my opinion, that I thought has been a bit overexposed in recent years. I thought there were some really good stories in the midst of all that. They've just kind of been all over the place, so I was extremely excited to hear that you were taking the reins on this title. What can we expect in the coming months from the Green Goliath filtered through your twisted consciousness?
If you've read the stuff so far, I think we're on issue 4 or 5 is the most recent one. I forget, but it's all been kind of a building towards the full-on Hulk versus Banner throwdown. The issue number 1 opened with the two characters split apart, and we still don't really know how that happened or who was responsible. It's kind of, being filled in slowly as we go along. And the arc that's going on now is, those two characters for the first time really going at it, and, physically in the real world. I mean, we've always seen Hulk and Banner fighting inside their minds for control of the same body. Now we see them literally trying to kill one another in the real world. And that battle will have a very clear winner and loser, and ends explosively, quite literally. It doesn't smooth things over and set things back up again, and everything's hunky dory. The way this arc ends is just another strange twist of the screw in the lives of these guys. So things aren't going to get all rosy for the Hulk anytime soon.
Yeah, and that sounds like an absolutely amazing journey. And as you'd mentioned, we always know the internal struggle between the Hulk and Banner, but now you're giving us the external struggle, and I'm really excited to see where that goes. I'm the biggest X-nerd on the planet. The Rev grew up a small, wee child in the 80s, addicted to the Chris Claremont stories, then through the big boom of the 90s with the cartoon and things. And I've got to say, just personally, what you're doing here with the Wolverine and the X-Men and even back to the Schism event, it's some of the most exciting stuff that I think the X universe has been faced with in a while. Can you take us through the journey of having to do that, of having to break up the X-Men?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'm glad you're digging it. it's great to hear that people who are like longtime X fans like what's going on. You know, it seems like we've also brought some people who haven't been checking out X-Men lately into the fold. I think there's a lot of good textbooks right now. I mean, I'm having a lot of fun with what I'm doing, but Kieran Gillen's Uncanny X-Men I think is great, and Rick Remender's Uncanny X-Force, you know, in particular, I think are two really, really good X-books, and I think between all the X-books, you've got very different kind of books, so you don't have to read one to understand the other. They're, you know, I think things connect together, but it's not completely interlocked to where, you know, you have to read everything. You can pick and choose, and I think get very different flavors of X-books. But yeah, Schism was something that had been building, you know, in the X universe for quite a while, even before I was really involved. But once I got involved, I really gravitated towards that story. I think for me, it made a lot of sense as an evolution for Wolverine with all the stuff that I've been doing. You know, I've been writing Wolverine literally as long as I've been in comics now. The first story I ever did was a Marvel Talent Search contest, which was a little Wolverine story. And since I came back to Marvel and have been working there full time, I've been doing Wolverine stuff that whole time. So I think all the stuff I've done with him, I think it all makes sense that this is kind of what the point he evolves to. Some people, some longtime X-fans, I think, were a little wary about the whole idea of Wolverine, you know, splitting from Cyclops and opening a school. They wondered, you know, is this me trying to neuter Wolverine or you know, take away the edge that people have always loved about him? But hopefully people see that that's still there. You know, he's a character who's always really gravitated towards those young, you know, that younger generation of X-Men, being protective of some of those characters, you know, with Kitty Pryde and Jubilee, and you know, now we see that with Ivy, and to me that all flows together with him being headmaster of a school. Not to mention the fact that I just think it's a lot of fun to suddenly put Wolverine, you know, in that Professor X role and watch him really struggle with that. I mean, it's not something he's used to, and not something that's easy for him, you know, which makes for good character drama, and hopefully the kind of X story we haven't seen before.
I do think that it would be just like, especially because I have been following the Wolverine story since you've been on board with them, and it is like it's the natural evolution of the character, and you've got a great voice for Wolverine, and I think it's part of that southern thing that you mentioned, being originally from Alabama. There's something about that really clicks with Wolverine.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, for some weird reason, even though he's, you know, the character's Canadian, he certainly, over the years, has developed that kind of, I don't know, some kind of down-home grittiness, and you know, there's a lot of kind of a spaghetti western hero in him, like the Clint Eastwood Man with No Name kind of stuff. So he's, you know, not to mention all the Japanese and Asian connection. So the character is like a real oddball mix of stuff. But yeah, it's one I certainly enjoy writing, and hopefully, you know, I've been able to develop a voice for him that people like.
And here's something that I want to ask about, because coming from the wrestling side of things in my career, I've worked in the capacity of what we call a booker, which is the closest thing that we would do to what you do, which is crafting things that would play out in stories that eventually would have a culmination. And you do get attached to the things that you create. And I know as a writer, you have to get attached, especially somebody like Wolverine or just the X-Men in general. After writing them for so long, you've got to feel like they're close to you or a part of you. I mean, even reading them for so many years, but then writing them later, did it just tear your guts out as much as it did mine? The final fight between Scott and Wolverine and Schism, just as a longtime fan, it was killing me. So I know having to be the voice of those characters, it had to take a toll on you, right?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of fun for me. I mean, that's the good stuff, you know, or maybe that speaks to me being emotionally flawed in some way, but that's the stuff I get excited about, you know, or working on Scalp that I do, the creator-owned book, you know, the stuff that at times is the most disturbing or emotionally troubling, you know, that's the good stuff. Like you like diving into that as a writer, and you know later you can look at it and say, oh, that was kind of awful and depressing, but you know, I get emotionally charged writing scenes that are emotionally charged, whether they're disturbing or funny or you know action packed or whatever. Just if it's got a charge in it, like you know that's good stuff. That's why you do this job. So yeah, the Schism just in general was a lot of fun to write.
It's just raw and it's real, and that's the true passion of what any artist does coming out in their work. And as you said, it's the high point when you can achieve it no matter what. But moving on, you know, two titles that we know are near and dear to you here we've discussed on the show a few times, in particular Punisher Max, which we know is wrapping up, as well as your creator-owned title, Scalp. Do you care to give reflections just on those in terms of their importance in your career?
Well, that sounds lofty when I try to put it that way. I mean, certainly two books I've, you know, very close to my heart in terms of all the stuff that I've done. Punisher Max, you know, that book's kind of an oddball, I think, in today's comic book market. You know, it's one big story over the course of 22 issues, I think, by the same creative team, which was awesome. Those guys, a lot of those guys kind of had to make sacrifices to be able to stay on that book. You know, it's not exactly burning up the sales chart, but it's one of those books, kind of like Scalp, that people who respond to it, you know, seem to respond to it strongly. I think that the last issue of Punisher Max we still have one more to come out. And I don't know, I'm interested to see what people think about it.
I'm anxiously awaiting it.
Well, I mean, hopefully it's a Punisher story you've never read before. I don't want to spoil what happens. I mean, if you've read the previous issue, you kind of know where it's headed and what's going on. But I'd just say this was always the plan from when I first took over the book, from you know when we started with Punisher Max #1. This was always where things were headed. And that actually there was a subway ride to Coney Island that I was on with Axel Alonso, you know, who was the editor on the book back then, is now editor-in-chief. And I kind of told him over the course of that subway ride, it's a long-ass ride across Brooklyn. Brooklyn's huge, I found out. So I told him the whole spiel, like from issue 1 on to the end, this is what I want to do, and you know, he let me do it, and now we're finally here, and you know, again, it's one of those things that's a little weird. I mean, it feels like I've been writing that book a long time, just like with Wolverine, and it's fun to when you have a big story like that to get to the end and you know, hopefully stick the landing, and you know, maybe you're a little sad when you look back and say, oh, that was fun, I'll never get to do that again, but you know, there's always something else to move on to. And you know, Scalp is the same way. I mean, Scalp I've been doing for 5-6 years now, so it'll be 60 issues by the time it's done, which I'm really proud of, because when issue 1 came out, you know, nobody knew who the hell I was. I was fresh off the banana boat, just coming out of nowhere. I was just a guy working at a warehouse in Kansas City who somehow stumbled his way into comics, and you know, doing a book about a Native American crime drama. It's not exactly something that people were banging on the doors of comic shops, you know, demanding more of. But
right.
Right. Like, where are all our Native American crime dramas? But, you know, somehow we were able to get 60 issues out of it, which is, I think, something to be proud of.
And if I'm not mistaken, both of those ended pretty much on your terms. You'd explain the Punisher Max, but also the Scalp. Is that something that you'd planned it to go that long and had ended it, or you just kind of found a stopping point and decided you were going to go there? How did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, the Punisher Max, that was always intended. This is one story, and this will wrap up. Scott was the same way. I never knew exactly what that issue number would be. You know, I always said when we were around issue 30 that we were about halfway. So that worked out to be exactly. So there were some stories that I always thought I would get to in Scalps that, we could have kept going, but you think at some point, you want to try to end on a high note. You want to go out when people still enjoy the book, and you don't want to overstay your welcome. And certainly once we started getting towards the end, I wanted to kind of build up momentum. I've always loved doing the standalone issues. I did a lot of standalone issues over the course of Scalp, but once we started getting closer, I just wanted to do big arcs and, try to wrap everything up on a big note.
It's certainly gotten a buzz about it. I've had a lot of recommendations for that. Scalp is not one I've gotten around to yet, but I'm definitely hoping to pick that up in the trade paper format. As far as Punisher Max, it's really disappointing to know that the sales weren't good for that, because I did my part at least. I own a couple of the trade papers on that one. That Kingpin copy that I have is so worn, I've shopped it around to all my friends saying, you've got to check this out. You've become a big hit in the NWA wrestling locker rooms across the country, I'll tell you that.
Well, that's good to know. That's good to know. And, it's a book that sells well. I mean, it doesn't. It's not selling as good as the Wolverine or the superhero stuff that I do. Just because it's mature readers' crime book. Marvel doesn't really do too many Max books right now. So, which again I think makes it all the more special that the whole team was able to stay together, and that Axel gave me the leeway to do exactly the kind of story that I wanted to do. And I think it's a Punisher story that, it's pretty evergreen. I think you can pick it up 5-10 years from now and read it, and it hopefully still be an enjoyable story that stands on its own.
But just the rise of the Kingpin in the beginning of it sets up everything so perfectly, where he's, it's a brutal, but it's sad and gritty and exciting all at the same time. It's just a real story of the lengths a guy's going to go in his rise for power, and just from the idea of the Kingpin being a myth and Wilson Fisk coming in and just usurping that role blew me away, and that was a lot of fun, man. So thank you for that excellent work.
Well, thanks. I mean, the idea of using the Kingpin was actually Axel's idea, because I had to follow Garth Ennis's run on Punisher, which to me is the run on that will define that character as long as there is a Punisher. And that was my favorite run pretty much on any Marvel book of the last several years. So to follow that was really intimidating. And I knew I couldn't come in and try to do the exact same kind of stories Garth had done. So it was Axel's idea of saying, why don't you do a Max version of the Kingpin? So I jumped on that, and I said, well, that's great, but if we're going to do that, we have to do a Max version of Bullseye, too, which was a lot of fun, figuring out, what that character would be in the Max universe, where he can't be the guy who, flicks toothpicks and stuff and kills people. But he's still got to be the assassin who never misses. So making him that kind of like a profiler where he could get in somebody's head, even Frank Castle's head, and figure out ways to get at him. That was a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, and the fact that he was batshit crazy, that did translate over to the Max universe, especially the part where he abducts the family and is, I'm Frank. That just blew me away.
Right. Well, it's a lot of fun to write batshit crazy, especially in Max, where there are no limitations. I can kind of go as far as I want it to go. But the idea that there's something about the Punisher's origin that it doesn't make sense as it's laid out. You start trying to figure out when exactly did he become the Punisher? Did he become the Punisher that day in Central Park when his family died? If you read some of the good stuff Garth did about Frank's time in Vietnam, you see he was pretty much that guy before his family died. So, it doesn't all fit together, and that's what Bullseye started to bang his head against. So he started trying to recreate those circumstances and find the family and have them killed right in front of him. So I like the idea that he just appeared on the surface to be just absolutely insane, and his methods were ridiculous and over the top. But then as it goes along, you find out, oh, he's actually really good at what he does, and he actually gets into Frank's head like nobody ever has.
Yes, absolutely. And fans can't say enough positive things about Punisher Max. Go out there and pick up your copies. There's trade paperbacks of every volume except for what's coming out now in the final arc, so you definitely want to pick that up. I know there's probably not a lot you can say at this point, given that we're not into it, but Avengers versus X-Men, we touched on it earlier. That is a motherfucking dream match that has only been teased with it a few times, never on a scale this epic. So just added to my pull list today. What, if anything, can you tell us about this coming up?
Can we use that as a cover blurb? A motherfucking dream match?
Absolutely. I would be honored.
Well, I mean, it's what you expect. It's what the title says. It's Avengers versus X-Men. It's a big superhero brawl. It's an epic story. It's 12 issues, 3 acts, and each act is a big escalation of the story. There's no real world metaphor like we've done with some of our events in the past. This is just Marvel's 2 biggest franchises beating the living shit out of each other. But a story where you've got both sides with really defensible positions. This doesn't come out of the gates with the X-Men as the villains or the Avengers as the villains. I think X-Men fans will be able to root for the X-Men, and Avengers fans will be able to root for the Avengers. And if you're somebody who is not reading either one of those franchises, it's still it's a book you can jump right into. Everything you need is contained within that book. And the simple pitch is, these aren't just Marvel's 2 biggest comic book franchises. These have obviously become their 2 biggest movie franchises, and then we've seen, Marvel's movies all building up towards the Avengers that comes out this year, and X-Men has been a very successful franchise for Fox. So this is the only time you can see those 2 franchises come head to head. And even if we could make this movie right now, to make this book into a movie would be about you need about a $6 billion special effects budget. That's the kind of stuff you can get away with in comics. Like, we have an unlimited budget, especially when you're working with such amazing artists. Like, if you can get them to draw it, you can do absolutely anything that comes into your head, which obviously you're a little more limited in Hollywood. So this is like the full-on balls-out biggest, Avengers versus X-Men fight you could ever possibly imagine.
That's everything I was hoping to hear. But you're absolutely right. It would be a $60 billion special effects budget, but the only limitations there are the artist's ability and imagination and your storytelling. And I think any fans that have been following know that there's really not a lot to worry about in that respect. But, just moving along to some various other topics here before we wrap up, I really appreciate you joining us again. The first thing that I read that you were writing was back on the Wolverine Weapon X title. I actually then went back and read the Ghost Rider thing that you did, which that right there was one of the things that made me start following you. First of all, the Ghost Rider, because he's always had trouble finding a voice that I thought fit him, and I thought that, doing the Blaze and catching that Heavens on Fire thing was really cool. But the Wolverine Weapon X, I was reading it, and there's a scene where Wolverine is stumbling out of a bar, and he's singing some Hank Williams Sr., and I thought that was cool as shit, because, Logan Payne, he was probably alive while Hank was around crooning. But then, of course, I also came to find out that you're a fellow Southerner. I'm here from Tennessee. You're just right down the road in Alabama, or now you're in Kansas City, but you're from Alabama. You said you Southern style, and that it helps your voice stand out. And that's awesome because, believe it or not, in pro wrestling, it's kind of a bad thing to be Southern if you can wrap your brain around that. But on the flip side of that, have you experienced any sort of discrimination in the comic book industry due to being from the South, beyond good-natured pig-fucking jokes?
Right. I get a lot of those from Rick Remender, who lives out in California. He loves to make the hillbilly pig-fucking jokes. No, I mean, I've never felt discriminated against or looked down upon. I mean, I think, if anything, I think it's helped me. And that, these days, you can break into comics from anywhere in the world. It's not like it used to be where you had to move to New York because that's where all the publishers were. I work with artists who are literally all over the world. In Scouts, the creative team on Scouts, we live in 4 different countries, between the group of us. So I think as a writer, it helps to be from some place where, not everybody else is from. I think it gives you a voice that stands out a little more. And there aren't a lot of, Southern writers in comics, not very many at all. I mean, Mark Waid is actually the only other guy I know who's from Alabama. But, I mean, he grew up there when he was real little, but I don't know if you'd call Mark Waid a Southern writer. I think he probably spent more time in the South than he did. So, I in my mind, that has helped, and that it does make you stand out. Not everybody needs to live in New York or California. And yeah, I love country music. I hated it when I was a kid. I used to be horrified when my dad would watch Hee Haw. I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever seen, and now I record it on my DVR so I can watch it.
That's really funny because that's the same way. I'm more of a metalhead myself, but in my old age, you go through life's trials and tribulations, and country music somehow identifies with you a little better as you've experienced a little more life. Sure,
and I love being from the South. There's a lot about it that I don't like, but I wouldn't change anything in terms of growing up there. I like Kansas City. I like where I live. We have better barbecue than the South. I have to admit that. But I consider myself proud if somebody would think of me as a Southern writer. I think that's great.
Very good.
And I grew up on a lot of Southern wrestling too. I remember we'd get wrestling probably out of Atlanta. But I remember like Bob Armstrong was one of my favorites, and I remember there were like a couple of different guys who would dress up like Lord Humongous from Road Warrior, which I thought was the most awesome thing ever. Even though the dude looked like he was probably about 6'2" or 6'3". It's not like he was a giant, but he'd still kind of push the rope down to step over it when he'd come in the ring. Like he was massive. But I thought that was the coolest shit I'd ever seen.
That is great. I've been all over that Alabama territory, and in Atlanta, that's another place where I've done most of the television stuff in my career. And going back, you run into all those old legends out on the circuit doing appearances. I've worked with Bob Armstrong like 15 times. He's the coolest old fella you ever meet. Smokes about 2 packs of cigarettes before he goes out of the ring, and could whip everyone in the building's ass at 80 years old still. Yeah, I'm sure he could beat my ass. Yeah, I remember there was one point where for some reason he got banned. He had to leave the wrestling, and then suddenly this dude showed up who was just called the Bullet, who was wearing a mask. So like Bob Armstrong had disappeared, but now the Bullet's back, and nobody knows who he was. Like, that was good stuff. I ate that shit up with a spoon. It was great, and unfortunately a lot of that is lost on the modern corporate version of wrestling with WWE, but that's another rant entirely.
Sure.
You got to experience some of the true good Southern wrestling.
Right. I find that there are a lot of comic fans among wrestlers, and there seems to be like a lot of wrestling comic fan crossover. I'm sure you could write a paper about the just the similarities between wrestling stories and superhero stories. There's a lot there, but there certainly does seem to be a lot of cross pollination.
Oh yeah, a lot of actually over in TNA Wrestling, which is on Spike TV every Thursday night at 9 o'clock. A couple of their big stars, Christopher Daniels and AJ Styles, we have the same agent and kind of came up around the same folks. They're huge comic book fans. I think Daniels has even done some guest like voiceovers for the little Marvel action figure videos they do. That's pretty cool. Well, man, we're wrapping up here of this interview, but it's been an awesome insight into the world of comic book writing. I greatly appreciate you again joining us. The last thing I'll ask you about here to talk about, we did mention that you grew up as a comic book fan, so you are living your dream, and kudos to you for that. But in the lines of most entertainment work like this, we do it because we love it. From that medium, what inspired you the most in terms of old comics that you grew up on? What were your favorites as a kid that made you want to pursue this even further?
Well, the first book I really fell in love with that made me a comic fan, the first book that I would, I had like where I had to get every issue of that was the Wolfman Perez New Teen Titans. Because I was a big DC guy when I was a kid. That's how I got into comics. And I was the perfect age for that book, and that was, great rip-roaring, full-on superheroes action. George Perez was the first comic book artist whose work I could recognize. When you have one of those guys and you can just look at a cover and say, "Oh, I know who drew that." Like that's a big thing when you start to be able to recognize different artists. So,
yeah,
that book was big. But then, after that, I discovered Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, and that was huge. And then Grant Morrison's really the guy who I knew, like, I want to do that. I want to do what he's doing. Because he really kind of blew up what people were doing with mainstream superhero books. And I would still say he's my favorite comic book writer of my life. But, yeah, I mean, I think it's a great time to be a comic book fan right now. I think, as a writer, you look back to the early 90s and you hear the stories about, the guys who would sell 6 million copies of a comic and, buy a house off of one issue of an Image book. So
wow.
You think, man, like I missed the heyday in terms of the money and the business side of things, but I think creatively, there's no comparison. I think these last few years, are far and away where I think we're putting out better comics as an industry. And in mainstream comics and in independent books. I mean, times are hard for everybody, and it took a little longer to catch up to comics, but it certainly has. And we've seen Marvel have to let people go. We've seen people struggle to get sales for independent and creator-owned books. So things aren't necessarily that rosy, but I think creatively, you've got a lot of creators out there really firing on all cylinders, doing good work.
Yeah, and not to plug the competition, but of course I guess it's too much competition since Scalp is with them. But with the new 52 thing that DC is doing, it seems to have generated a lot of interest. So I hope that translates over for everyone, whether it be Marvel, DC, or independents, to a bunch of new comic book fans. Because I agree with you. I think there's so much stuff to choose from out there right now that it really could appeal to any type of comic book fan. I've got like 6 or 7 titles that I'm going with monthly now, and there's so much more that I want to get that just the budget limits.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's good stuff inside the mainstream, and there's good stuff out. I think it's it's a shame that to the normal person when you mention comic books, they think superheroes, that they think that one genre is really representative of the entire medium. Certainly that's if you want to make a living doing comics, you pretty much have to write superhero books. I mean, that's what, dominates the sales chart for the industry. But there are a lot of great books outside of superhero comics as well. So, I mean, I read stuff all over the map. I read a lot of the New 52 books. I'm friends with some of those guys like Scott Snyder and Jeff Lemire. I think are doing awesome work over there.
That Animal Man is crazy.
It's great, right? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's a small industry. Everybody knows each other for the most part. Everybody gets along, and yeah, it's a good time to be working in comics.
Awesome. Well, on that note, my friend Jason Aaron, thank you again for joining the Midnight Black Mass. We greatly appreciate you taking us into the world of Marvel and DC Comics. If you're ever at DragonCon in Atlanta, I know you don't do a lot of the cons, but hit me up. We'll have a few brews. I usually only have to work one night at the con, and the rest of it's just pure debauchery. So
I will do that.
Tear it up.
DragonCon was the first convention I ever went to. I would go every year back when I lived in Alabama. But yeah, I haven't been back in a while, but I'd love to come back.
Well, absolutely. I would like to see you down there, man. Well, take care of yourself. Best of luck in the future, and thank you so much for joining the broadcast.
All right.
And we are out of time, folks. Thank you for joining the Midnight Black Mass. We appreciate you following us on youtube.com/pottyhumor or the Beyond Ringside Radio Network or on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you reach us. We'll be back next week with former WCW Nitro announcer Scott Hudson on the Midnight Black Mass. Keep one foot in the gutter and one fist in the gold, two horns in the air, and I'm out.
Thank you.